The hearing aid sat in a Ziploc bag on my workbench for 4 months before I could open it. I am a man who fixes things for a living, or I was, before I retired and kept doing it anyway because a shop full of dead clocks is better company than an empty house. I understand mechanisms. Gears, springs, the small deliberate architecture that makes a broken thing tell time again. What I could not understand, could not make myself look at, was a pair of tiny plastic devices that used to sit behind my wife's ears and had nothing more to tell me now that she was gone. Lou died on a Thursday in March. Heart failure, the doctor said, sudden and probably painless, the kind of death that sounds almost like a mercy when someone says it fast enough. She'd been failing for months before that, dizzy spells, names that slipped out of reach mid-sentence, mornings she couldn't find the coffee tin that had sat in the same cabinet for 30 years. I told myself it was age. I told myself a lot of things that spring. Our daughter Bree found her. She said she'd stopped by to drop off groceries and Lou was already on the kitchen floor, already gone. I held Bree that night while she cried into my shoulder, and I thought, at least I still have this much of her mother left standing in front of me. The hearing aids were in the bag the hospital handed back along with Lou's wedding ring and her reading glasses. I couldn't touch any of it for a long time. Grief has a way of making ordinary objects radioactive. Yesterday I finally opened the bag. I told myself I wanted them cleaned and stored properly, the way I'd store any fine instrument, and Lou's aids were fine instruments, custom-fitted, expensive, with enough memory in them to log her hearing environment for weeks at a stretch so her audiologist could fine-tune them. I drove them over to Marcus Yates, who has run his little storefront on Broughton Street for 6 years now and has always treated me like family. Ever since I helped him make rent his first winter in business, Marcus took the case from me with the easy smile he always has, and then he turned it over and read the serial number stamped on the charging port. And the smile went out of his face like a switch had been thrown. "Mr. Doyle," he said. "When's the last time these sync to the cloud portal?" I told him I didn't know, that Lou handled all that herself. He didn't answer right away. He walked to the front of his shop, flipped the sign to closed, and turned the deadbolt with a click that seemed too loud for the quiet street outside. "Comin' back," he said. I followed him into the little room behind the counter where he keeps his diagnostic equipment, and he sat down and plugged the case into a cable I didn't recognize and started typing. His hands weren't steady. "A few weeks after Mrs. Doyle passed," he said, not looking at me. "I ran a routine audit on the accounts I service. Standard housekeeping. I found a corrupted sync log tied to this serial number, a deletion attempt, time-stamped almost exactly to the hour she died." He glanced up. "Somebody tried to wipe the onboard memory. They just didn't know these particular units cache a local backup independent of the wireless sync. I built that redundancy in myself, for exactly this kind of failure. I never imagined I'd be using it like this." I sat very still. My whole life I have made my living out of understanding how small parts fit into a working whole, and right then nothing was fitting. "Wiped by who?" I asked. "Wiped why?" Marcus shook his head. "I don't know who. I've had the recovery running in the background for weeks, whenever I had server time free. I didn't want to call you until I knew what I actually had, in case it was nothing. In case it was just a glitch." He swallowed. "It isn't a glitch." He turned the monitor so I could see it. A waveform, jagged and full of gaps, with a progress bar crawling along beneath it. "These aids don't record video, obviously," he said. "But they do log ambient audio in short buffered clips, for calibration, background noise, voices, anything the hearing environment analysis needs. Most of it gets discarded automatically after processing. This clip didn't get discarded. It got targeted for deletion instead. Which tells me somebody understood exactly what these devices could hold and panicked about it." The bar filled. A tinny, broken audio file began to play through his desktop speakers, and I heard the particular quality of my own kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock I built her 30 years ago that still hangs over the stove. Lou's breathing, ragged, and beneath it, very faint, another sound. Footsteps. Not rushing. Not frantic. Even, unhurried, the sound of someone standing and waiting rather than someone racing to help. the recording cut out 4 seconds later in a burst of static, the deletion catching up with itself mid-transmission, and then there was nothing. I did not move for a long moment. I have spent my whole life listening for the small sound that means a mechanism is failing, a scrape where there should be a smooth turn, a tick a half beat off rhythm. I know what wrongness sounds like even when I can't yet name it. And what I just heard was wrong in a way no natural death explains. Somebody was in that kitchen with her, I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. Somebody was in that kitchen with her, Marcus repeated, and did not go get help. And then somebody tried very hard to make sure nobody would ever know that. I thought of Bree, finding her mother already gone. I thought of the specific, careful way she told that story, not once repeating a single detail differently. The way people do when they're remembering rather than reciting. I told Marcus I needed him to keep working, to recover whatever else might be buried in that cache, and to tell no one, not his staff, not his wife, no one, that I had been in his shop today. He agreed, though I could see it cost him something, the fear sitting behind his eyes like a held breath. I put a hand on his shoulder and thanked him, and I meant it more than the words could carry. I was still standing on the sidewalk outside his shop, the March wind cutting through my coat, when my phone rang. Bree's name on the screen, Daddy, she said, warm as ever, warm as she'd been every day since the funeral. Julian and I are coming by this afternoon. There's some paperwork with the estate we really need you to sign, nothing complicated, just some transfer authorizations so I can help manage things while you're still, adjusting. We'll be there by 3, I looked at my own hand holding the phone. Steady. Unremarkable. A clockmaker's hand, trained for 40 years to move exactly as much as it needed to and no more. Of course, sweetheart, I said. I'll be here. I hung up and stood there a moment longer, doing the kind of math I have done my whole life without ever once expecting to need it for this. 3 hours. 3 hours to decide who I needed to become before that car pulled into my driveway. I spent the 3 hours before they arrived doing the only thing that had ever made sense to me when everything else didn't. I went into my workshop behind the house and I worked. There is a discipline to opening a watch case that steadies a mind no matter what is happening outside it. You cannot force a case back. You cannot rush a movement. You either learn the patience the mechanism demands or you break something you can't replace. I sat at my bench with a gentleman's pocket watch I'd been restoring for a client in Charleston, and I let my hands remember what stillness felt like while my mind built, piece by piece, the man I was going to have to become by 3 o'clock. Odessa found me there around 2. She'd worked for Lou and me for 11 years, since before Bree left for college, and she moved through our house the way she moved through everything, quiet. Watchful, never in the way. She set a glass of iced tea on the corner of my bench, the real kind, sweet and dark, nothing like what was coming later. You've been out here since noon, she said. It wasn't a question, thinking, about Bree and Julian coming by. She didn't phrase that as a question either. Odessa rarely asked things she already knew the shape of. Mr. Doyle, can I say something and have you not think I'm speaking out of turn? I set down my loop. You've never once spoken out of turn in this house. She was quiet a moment, choosing her words the way she chose everything, carefully. Something's felt wrong here since Miss Lou passed. I can't tell you what. I just know this house used to sound a certain way and it doesn't sound that way anymore. She glanced toward the main house, toward the kitchen window. Bree comes by more than she used to. Always with something for you to sign, always with something to drink for you. I don't know what that adds up to. I just wanted you to know somebody else has noticed. I looked at her for a long moment, and something in my chest, some old tight thing, loosened just slightly. I had spent 4 months alone with a grief I couldn't share and a growing wrongness I hadn't yet had the courage to name out loud to another living person. Marcus had named it for me that morning. Now Odessa had named it too, from a different angle, without knowing what she was naming. If anything ever seems strange to you, I said carefully, I would want you to tell me. Even if it seems like nothing, I will. She studied my face a moment longer, then nodded once, like she'd filed something away, and went back inside. They arrived at 3:10, Julian's car turning into the drive too fast, the way it always did, like he was perpetually running from something just behind him. I met them in the entry hall and I let my shoulders round forward the way I'd practiced, let my hand drift to the doorframe as if I needed it. Bree came in first and hugged me, and it was a real hug, the kind she used to give me as a girl, arms all the way around, face pressed into my shoulder for a second too long. That was the hardest part of all of it. Right from the start. My daughter's love for me had not entirely stopped being real. It had just become something with a second purpose riding underneath it, and I could not yet see all the way to the bottom of that. "Daddy, you look tired," she said, pulling back to study my face. Her eyes were Lou's eyes, and it undid something in me every time. "I'm all right, sweetheart." Julian hung back near the door in his linen shirt and his easy gallery opening smile, the one he wore for donors and collectors, the one that had probably worked on a great many people before it stopped working on me. "Good to see you up and about, Everett," he said, and clapped my shoulder like we were old friends at a golf club. Which we had never once been. We drove in Julian's car to the lawyer's office, and I sat in the back the way I imagined a tired old man would sit, watching the live oak slide past the window along Bull Street with what I hoped read as vacant contentment rather than careful observation. Bree turned around in her seat to talk to me. "It's really nothing complicated, Daddy," she said. "Just some transfer authorizations. With the estate still tangled up in probate, it makes everything so much simpler if I can act on your behalf for routine things. Bank matters. Bills. That kind of thing, whatever you think is best," I said, and let my voice go a little thin at the edges. The office wasn't Desmond's office. I noticed that immediately, though I said nothing. Desmond's firm occupied a handsome brick building downtown with his name carved into limestone above the door, a place Lou and I had visited a dozen times over 30 years to update wills and deeds and every ordinary piece of a family's paperwork. This was a strip mall off Abercorn, wedged between a nail salon and a check cashing place, with a laminated sign in the window that read Ashford Vance Legal Services, a name I did not recognize and had never heard Bree mention before. A young man in an ill-fitting suit met us at the door, introduced himself as an associate, and led us into a small conference room that smelled like carpet cleaner. He set a stapled document in front of me and clicked his pen. "This grants Bree limited authority to manage routine accounts on your behalf," he said, tapping the signature line. Standard language. Shouldn't take but a minute. I looked down at the page. The print was small, dense, the kind of document a person is meant to skim rather than read. I could feel Bree watching me, could feel Julian standing just behind my chair with his hand resting lightly on the back of it, and I understood, with the particular clarity I usually reserved for a stubborn movement that refused to keep time, that I was looking at the first turn of a key in a lock I did not yet fully understand. I patted my jacket pockets slowly. One and then the other, and let my face crumple into confusion. "I don't have my reading glasses," I said. "I must have left them on the workbench. I can read it to you," the associate offered. "No," I said, and shook my head with the particular stubbornness Lou used to tease me about. Lou always told me, "Never sign what you can't read with your own eyes." I pushed the papers back an inch. "I'll take it home. Read it properly this weekend." The silence that followed lasted exactly as long as it took Julian's hand to tighten, just slightly, on the back of my chair. I felt it more than saw it. "Dad, we really don't want this dragging out," Bree said, and there was an edge under the warmth now. Thin as a hairline crack in a crystal face. "The probate deadline is coming up and there's a lot riding on us having this handled cleanly. I'll have it back to you Monday," I said mildly, and looked at her with what I hoped was nothing but a tired old man's stubbornness. It was Julian who smoothed it over, in the end, the way he always did, a light laugh, a hand on Bree's shoulder, an easy word about how of course her father should take his time, no rush at all. Family isn't about rushing anybody. But his eyes when he looked at me over her head weren't easy at all. They drove me home in a car gone quiet in a way that had weight to it. When we pulled into the drive, Bree twisted around again. And this time she reached into an insulated bag at her feet and produced a thermos. "I made you tea," she said. "The chamomile blend, the one I used to make for Mama when her nerves were bad. It'll help you sleep tonight, help clear your head before you look at those papers." She poured some into the thermos cup and pressed it into my hands, warm through the plastic. faintly sweet-smelling with something underneath the sweetness I couldn't name yet but didn't like. "Thank you, sweetheart," I said, and held it the whole ride up the drive, and did not drink it. Inside, I told them I was tired, and Julian said something about needing to get back for a client call, and within 20 minutes their car was gone down the street and I was alone in my kitchen with a cup of tea I had no intention of drinking and a great deal I still needed to understand. I carried the cup out to the sunroom, where Lou had kept a small jungle of houseplants she'd nursed for 20 years, ferns and philodendrons crowding the windowsill in a way I'd never had the heart to thin out after she was gone. I chose the healthiest one, a Boston fern with fronds so green and full it looked like it belonged somewhere with more rain than Savannah gets, and I poured the tea slowly into the soil at its base, watching it vanish into the dark earth. Then I went to bed, and did not sleep much, and in the morning I came downstairs and stood in the doorway of the sunroom for a long time without moving. The fern was dead. Not wilted, not drooping, dead, the fronds gone the color of wet ash overnight. Curled in on themselves like something had reached into the plant and scorched it from the inside. The soil beneath it had a faint yellowish cast that hadn't been there 12 hours earlier. I stood there a long time with my hands very still at my sides, doing the kind of arithmetic that comes naturally to a man who has spent his whole life understanding what happens when small, precise forces are applied to something living, over and over, for long enough. The dead fern told me everything and nothing. It told me what they were doing. It didn't tell me why, or how far the rot went, or how much time I actually had before the number in whatever ledger existed with my name on it clicked over from asset to liability. I needed the why. And I had an idea where to find it. 2 days after the fern, Odessa mentioned, almost in passing while she was polishing the silver Lou and I had barely used in a decade, that she still cleaned for Bree and Julian every other Wednesday, same as she had since they'd bought the house on Whitaker Street. She said it carefully, watching my face, like she wasn't sure whether that fact would upset me or interest me. "They're driving up to look at some event hall Thursday," she added. "Bree mentioned it Sunday when she dropped off your prescriptions. Something about a party they're planning." I kept my hand steady on the newspaper I wasn't reading. "What day is your next Wednesday there?" "Tomorrow." I told her I wanted to come along, that I had some of Lou's old recipe cards I wanted to leave in Bree's kitchen, sentimental things, the kind of excuse that made sense coming from a grieving old man with too much time and too many boxes of his late wife's belongings still unsorted. Odessa didn't ask why I needed a whole Wednesday afternoon to deliver a stack of index cards. She just looked at me for a long moment, the way she'd looked at me in the workshop, filing something else away, and said she'd pick me up at 10. Bree and Julian's house was the kind of restored Savannah townhouse that photographed beautifully for the gallery openings Bree used to host before the gallery started hemorrhaging money. 12-foot ceilings, heart pine floors, a curved staircase that Lou had once called showing off with excellent taste. Odessa let herself in with her own key, called out that it was just her, and got no answer. They'd already left for the coast. I told her I'd let myself out when I was done, that she should focus on her work and not worry about me poking around an old man's memories in the kitchen. She hesitated at the bottom of the stairs, dust cloth in hand, and I watched something pass behind her eyes, not quite suspicion, not quite permission, something in between. Then she nodded and went to start upstairs, and I was alone on the ground floor of my daughter's house with roughly 2 hours and a theory I badly wanted to be wrong. I did not go to the kitchen. I went to Julian's study, a narrow room off the back hall that Bree had once called his sanctuary, back when she still used possessive, affectionate words about her husband's habits. There was a large abstract painting on the far wall, something in blues and grays that Julian had always claimed was a minor find from an estate sale, the kind of story people tell about art when they don't want you asking where it really came from. I have hung enough clocks in enough houses over enough decades to know that a painting hanging slightly too far from its neighbors, on a wall with no other art competing for space, is usually hiding something. It swung out from the wall on a discreet hinge. And behind it sat a wall safe, the kind with a mechanical dial rather than the cheap electronic keypads that flood the market now. I felt something in my chest ease slightly at the sight of it. A keypad I couldn't have done anything with. A dial, I understood in my bones the way I understand an escapement. I have spent 40 years learning to feel the exact moment a will seats itself against a jewel, to hear the difference between a movement that is ticking correctly and one that is a half beat off in a way no untrained ear would catch. A tumbler lock speaks the same language, just louder. I knelt in front of the safe, pressed my ear close to the cool metal, and began to turn the dial with the same unhurried patience I'd give a client's heirloom watch. The first number surrendered itself in under a minute, a faint metallic settling I felt more than heard. The second took longer, my fingers working slowly, listening for the particular give that meant a wheel had dropped into its notch. By the third number my knees ached against the hardwood, and somewhere upstairs I could hear the rhythmic hum of Odessa's vacuum, a small mercy of cover noise. The fourth number clicked home, and I turned the handle, and the heavy little door swung open on a soft, well-oiled hinge. Inside was a slim accordion file, the kind with color-coded tabs, and beneath it a manila envelope with nothing written on the outside at all. I pulled the accordion file first. Bank statements, 3 different LLCs I didn't recognize, correspondence with a private wealth manager about accelerating a probate timeline. And beneath a tab marked simply deadline, a single sheet with a date circled in red ink, 12 days from the day I was kneeling on that floor. A note beneath it in Bree's handwriting, the same looping hand she'd used on birthday cards since she was 8 years old. If not settled by this date, estate reverts to full charitable disbursement per Mom's original directive. No further access, so there it was. Not vague greed. A closing window. A number on a calendar that made my continued existence, past a certain point, financially catastrophic to my own daughter. I set the file down with hands that had gone very still, and opened the manila envelope. It was a single document, 4 pages, a medical directive with Lou's signature at the bottom, dated 6 weeks before she died. I had never seen it. I had certainly never signed anything acknowledging it, though there was a line at the bottom meant for a spouse's countersignature, left conspicuously blank. The directive named Bree as sole healthcare proxy, granted her authority over end-of-life decisions, and, buried in paragraph 3, in language dense enough that a grieving, distracted man might have skimmed past it, waived any requirement for extraordinary intervention in the event of a cardiac episode. I know my wife's signature the way I know the sound of my own front door. I signed 40 years of anniversary cards beside that signature. And the one on this page was wrong in a way that would mean nothing to a stranger and meant everything to me, a hairline hesitation at the L, a slight forward slant Lou's hand never carried, the kind of near-perfect forgery you get from someone who studied the real thing for months rather than years. Bree hadn't reluctantly gone along with something Julian orchestrated. Bree had built the paper trail herself, practiced her own mother's signature until it was close enough to fool a hospital, close enough to fool me, and tucked it into a safe behind a painting she probably walked past a dozen times a day without flinching. I do not know how long I knelt there on that floor. Long enough that my knees had gone from aching to numb. There is a particular kind of stillness that comes over me when I understand, finally, exactly how a mechanism has failed, not confusion anymore, not the frantic search for an answer, but the flat, cold clarity of having found it. I felt that stillness settle into me now, and underneath it, something colder still, the last thin thread of a father's instinct to explain this away, snapping. I photographed both documents with the phone Marcus had shown me how to use properly, careful to keep the angle low, the flash off, my own reflection out of frame. I photographed the circled date. I photographed the blank line where my signature should have been and never was. Then, from the front of the house, I heard the specific, unmistakable growl of Julian's car turning into the drive, a full hour before I'd expected either of them back. I did not have the luxury of finishing carefully. I slid the medical directive back into its envelope with hands that had gone from steady to fast, replaced the accordion file exactly where it had sat, and spun the dial hard, scrambling the tumblers back into silence. The safe door clicked shut. I swung the painting back into place, checked the angle against the faint outline of dust on the wall where it always hung, and had just stepped back into the hallway when I heard the front door open and Julian's voice call out. Easy and unsuspecting, asking if anyone was home, I met him in the front hall with a stack of Lou's recipe cards in my hand and my heart going hard enough that I could feel it in my throat, and I let my shoulders round forward, let my face go soft and slightly lost, and told him I'd just been leaving something for Bree in the kitchen, that I hoped he didn't mind an old man letting himself wander through his daughter's house. Julian looked at me for one long moment, his easy smile not quite reaching his eyes, and I understood, with the same cold clarity I'd felt kneeling in front of that safe, that from this point forward, every second I spent under this roof would need to be a performance flawless enough to survive exactly this kind of scrutiny. I got through the rest of that visit on reflexes alone, a few more minutes of vague, grateful mumbling, a promise to Bree over the phone that yes, I was resting, yes, I'd eaten, and then Odessa drove me home in a silence that had a different weight to it than our silences usually carried. She didn't ask what I'd been doing in that house for 2 hours. I didn't tell her. But when she dropped me at my door, she held onto my hand a beat longer than she needed to, and said, "Whatever this is, Mr. Doyle, I hope you're being careful," and I understood that she'd stopped needing an explanation to know something was very wrong. That night I called Desmond Okafor, and I had known each other since before either of us had gray in our hair. Back when he was a young associate handling probate work and I was a jeweler's loop squinting kid trying to talk his landlord into a longer lease on his first shop. He'd done our will. He'd done Lou's mother's estate. He'd sat at our dinner table more times than I could count, and he'd sat in the second pew at Lou's funeral with his hand on my shoulder the whole service. I told him everything. The recording. The dead fern. The safe, the deadline, the forged directive. I laid it out the way I'd lay out a broken movement on a cloth, piece by piece, in order, without embellishment, because embellishment is how you lose track of what's actually true. Desmond didn't say much while I talked. When I finished, there was a long quiet on the line, and then he said, in a voice gone very flat and very careful, "Send me what you photographed. All of it. Tonight, if you can." I did. And the next morning he came to the shop instead of his office, let himself in through the back like he'd done 100 times over 30 years, and sat down across my workbench with his laptop and a face I didn't recognize on him, not the warm, deliberate courtroom face I'd known for decades, but something colder, more exacting, the face of a man doing math he didn't like the answer to. "The deadline checks out," he said without preamble. 12 days from today. I pulled the probate filing this morning under pretext of a routine estate review. Nobody blinks at an old family attorney checking in. Lou's original trust reverts fully to the audiology foundation she named if it isn't restructured by that date. After that, Bree has no legal claim to touch a dollar of it. He turned the laptop toward me. "That much matches what you found in the safe, and the rest?" He was quiet a moment. "The rest is worse." He pulled up a set of financial records, bank statements, wire logs, a name I didn't recognize repeated across a dozen documents, a private collector named Aldous Renner, based out of Charleston, the kind of man who bought art the way other men bought racehorses, for status and for leverage in roughly equal measure. Julian sold him 3 paintings over the last 2 years. Desmond said. Supposedly attributed pieces, minor works by real, dead artists, the kind of thing that's hard to authenticate and easy to overprice if the provenance paperwork looks clean enough. Renner paid just under $2 million combined. He tapped the screen. All 3 have since been independently assessed as forgeries. Good ones. Good enough to fool a buyer who wanted badly enough to believe in them. But forgeries, I sat with that. I have spent my life around craft, around the difference between a piece built with integrity and one built to deceive, and something in me recoiled harder at that word, forgery, than it had at almost anything else in this whole ugly business. Which told me something about myself I didn't have time to examine just then. "Renner found out," I said, "Renner found out." Desmond's jaw was tight. "About 4 months ago, near as I can tell, right around the time Bree first started drawing hard on the gallery's accounts to cover shortfalls. Renner didn't go to the police. Men like that rarely do. He went to Julian directly. The correspondence I found, through channels I'd rather not detail to you, Everett, for both our sakes, makes it plain enough. Julian either makes him whole, with interest, or Renner ruins him. Publicly. Professionally. Possibly worse. How much interest? Call it 3 million, all told, and a deadline of his own. Sooner than yours. He looked up at me. Your daughter isn't just chasing an inheritance. Everett. She's trying to buy her husband out of a hole he dug that's about to collapse on both of them. I don't say that to excuse what they did to Lou, or what they're doing to you. I say it because you need to understand the shape of the thing you're up against. Desperate men make different mistakes than greedy ones. Sometimes worse ones. I thought about Julian's face in that front hall, the half-second before his easy smile clicked back into place, not the smooth, practiced concern I'd seen from him at every family dinner for 6 years, but something rawer underneath it, something that had looked, for just an instant, like a man doing his own arithmetic and not liking the number either. "There's a storage unit," Desmond said, pulling my attention back. "Out past the Truman Parkway. Leased under an LLC that traces back to Julian through 2 shell layers, which took my investigator most of a week to untangle. I had someone drive by yesterday. It's exactly what you'd think." He showed me a handful of photographs, dim, taken quickly through a gap in a rolled-up door, the investigator's own reflection ghosting faintly in a few of them. Canvases stacked against the walls, some finished, some half-done, easels and pigment and a card table cluttered with reference books on brushwork and period varnish techniques. A forger's workshop, patient and unglamorous, nothing like the sleek gallery Bree ran on Broughton Street. "He's still making them," I said quietly, "he's still making them." Which tells me Renner's deadline hasn't been met yet, and Julian's out of legitimate ways to meet it. Desmond closed the laptop halfway, the light from the screen sliding off his face. "Everett, I want to say something to you plainly, and I want you to hear it as your friend and not just your lawyer. What you found is enough to destroy them both, Bree for what she did to Lou, Julian for the fraud. But if we hand this to the police today, a decent defense attorney tears the poisoning case to pieces before it ever gets in front of a jury. No living witness. A dead plant instead of a body's worth of physical evidence. A recording with a hole right where the confession should be. It's not enough yet. Not on its own, so we make it enough." He looked at me for a long moment, the way he used to look at opposing counsel across a negotiating table, weighing whether I understood what I was actually proposing. "There's a way to do this," he said slowly, "that doesn't rely on a jury believing your word against theirs. Julian's already committed federal fraud once, selling forgeries as authentic works. If he does it again, knowingly, to someone we control, that's not circumstantial anymore. That's a controlled buy. That's the kind of case that doesn't fall apart in a courtroom." He paused. "I have a contact who used to run undercover work for the Bureau's Art Crimes Unit before he went private. If Julian's desperate enough for Renner's money, he'll take a new buyer's cash just as fast, and this time we'll be the ones writing the script." I understood, sitting there in my own workshop with the smell of clock oil and old brass all around me, that I had crossed some final threshold without quite noticing the exact step. I had started this because I wanted to understand how my wife died. Somewhere in that safe, kneeling in front of a forged signature, I had stopped being a man trying to understand a tragedy and become a man building a case. And now, sitting across from Desmond, I was agreeing to help engineer the next crime my son-in-law would commit, so that it would be the one that finally buried him. "Do it," I said. "Whatever you need from me," Desmond nodded once, already reaching for his phone. "I'll need a few days to get the buyer set up properly, a cover identity Julian has no reason to question, a plausible reason he's suddenly interested in exactly the kind of minor attributed pieces Julian specializes in forging. It has to feel organic. If Julian smells a setup, we lose him, and worse, we tip our hand to Bree. How long? A week, maybe a little more, to build it right." He was already scrolling through something on his screen, his mind visibly moving 3 steps ahead. "I'll need you to keep doing exactly what you've been doing. Stay small. Stay slow. Give them no reason to accelerate anything on their end while we're setting our own trap." I thought about the 12 days on that circled calendar date in Bree's safe, ticking down whether I was ready or not, and said, "We don't have unlimited runway here, Desmond. There's a deadline on my side of this too, I know." He didn't look up. "I'm not going to pretend this isn't tight." He was quiet for a moment, scrolling, and then he stopped scrolling entirely and looked up at me with an expression I hadn't seen on him yet in this whole conversation, something close to surprise. "Everett," he said slowly. Did Bree ever mention anything to you about a party? A vow renewal, something at Ashgrove Hall. The name meant nothing to me at first, and then it did, a stray comment Bree had made weeks ago. Before any of this had cracked open, something about celebrating 10 years with Julian, something about wanting to do it right this time, a real ceremony, family and friends, the kind of event she'd always wanted and never quite gotten around to. I'd nodded along at the time the way you nod along at a daughter's plans, half listening, grieving too hard to hold on to details that didn't seem to matter yet. She mentioned something, I said. Why? Desmond turned the laptop around so I could see the calendar entry he'd pulled up, a save-the-date notice he'd found buried in an event venue's booking records while he was tracing Julian's finances. A date, a location, Ashgrove Hall, and beneath it, in smaller print, a deposit paid 3 weeks ago from an account that traced, eventually, back to the same tangle of shell entities funding Julian's forgeries. The date sat exactly inside the same 7-day window as Renner's deadline. The same window, near enough, as the deadline ticking down and lose trust. Desmond looked at me across the workbench, and for the first time since he'd sat down, I saw something shift behind his eyes, not fear exactly, but the particular alertness of a man who has just watched several separate problems collapse, without warning, into a single converging point. Everett, he said quietly. I think we may have just found where all of this is going to end. Desmond's undercover buyer materialized within the week, a soft-spoken man calling himself Nathaniel Cross, ostensibly a private collector relocating to Savannah from Boston, hungry for exactly the kind of minor attributed works Julian specialized in producing. Desmond had built the cover with a real estate listing, a fabricated auction history, even a modest social presence that would survive a cursory search. It was, Desmond assured me, enough to survive Julian's due diligence without inviting the kind that would survive a lawyer's. Cross reached out to the gallery through a mutual contact Desmond had cultivated years ago in the Charleston art world, expressing interest in a minor coastal landscape. The kind of piece that wouldn't draw scrutiny but would move real money. Julian responded within a day. I know because Desmond showed me the email exchange, forwarded through a channel I didn't ask too many questions about, Julian's tone in it warm and professional and entirely unlike the man I'd watched flinch in his own front hall. He's motivated, Desmond told me over the phone that evening. Almost too motivated. He offered Cross a private viewing inside 48 hours. That's not a man with room to negotiate. Renner's deadline, I said, has to be close. Closer than what he told Bree, probably. Men in that position tend to keep the worst of it to themselves as long as they can. I found myself, against every instinct I'd built over the past weeks, thinking about Julian not as a monster but as a man standing at the edge of something he'd started years ago and could no longer climb back out of. It didn't soften what he'd done. It didn't make me want anything less than his complete downfall. But it sat differently in my chest than my feelings about Bree did, and I noticed the difference, and I let myself notice it, because pretending otherwise felt like exactly the kind of dishonesty that had gotten Lou killed in the first place. 3 days after that call, I was in Bree's kitchen again. I'd taken to visiting twice a week now, always with some small pretext. A jar of Lou's fig preserves I claimed to have found in the pantry. A question about which of Lou's serving dishes Bree wanted to keep. Odessa let me in most days. That afternoon it was Bree herself who opened the door, and something about her face told me before she said a word that this visit was going to be different from the others. She'd lost weight in the past month. I'd noticed it distantly before, the way you notice weather, but standing in her doorway I saw it clearly, the hollows under her eyes, the brittle brightness in her voice when she said my name, Daddy. I wasn't expecting you today. I won't stay long, I said, holding up the small tin I'd brought as an excuse. Just wanted to drop this off. She let me in, but she didn't move toward the kitchen the way she usually did. She stood in the front hall with her arms crossed, studying my face with an intensity that made the muscles across my shoulders go tight beneath my sweater. I had spent weeks learning to hold a certain looseness in my body, a certain vagueness around the eyes. I held it now, deliberately, while she looked at me the way I imagined she looked at a piece in the gallery she suspected wasn't what it claimed to be. You seem different lately, she said finally. Different how? I don't know. She uncrossed her arms, recrossed them the other way. Sharper, maybe. The other week you couldn't remember where Mama kept the sugar. Last time you were here you corrected me on the year we redid the porch. You said 2019. It was 2019. A short, humorless laugh. I looked it up after you left. I don't know why I looked it up. I let a beat of silence sit there, long enough to feel authentic, and then I gave her the same vacant half-smile I'd been practicing since the night I stood in front of my bedroom mirror learning to become a stranger to myself. I have good days, I said. The doctor says that's normal. Comes and goes, which doctor? It wasn't really a question. Her eyes had gone very still, the way Lou's used to when she was working out a difficult chord change and wouldn't be interrupted until she found it. You haven't mentioned a doctor's name to me once, Daddy. Not once in 4 months. My pulse ticked up, and for a moment I let myself feel the fear honestly rather than fighting it, because I have learned that the truest performance of fear is the one that costs you nothing to produce. I don't remember his name off the top of my head, I said, and let my voice waver at the edges. Is that important? She studied me a moment longer. Then, abruptly, the tension went out of her shoulders, replaced by something that looked almost like grief. No, she said quietly. I'm sorry. I don't know what's wrong with me lately. I just feel like I don't recognize this house anymore. Like everything's shifted half an inch and I can't tell if it's you or me, there is a version of me. The man I was for 68 years before Marcus called me into that back room, who would have crossed that hallway and put his arms around his daughter and told her everything was going to be fine. I did not move. I stood there and let her carry that grief alone, because the alternative was letting her see how close her instincts had actually landed, and closeness was the one thing I could not afford her right now. She excused herself not long after that, claiming a headache, and I let myself out. I found Odessa in the side garden, deadheading the roses Lou had planted along the fence line a decade ago. The ones Bree had never quite managed to keep as well tended. Odessa looked up when she heard my footsteps on the gravel and set down her shears. She cornered me yesterday, Odessa said, before I could speak. No greeting, no preamble, just the flat delivery of someone who'd been carrying something and wanted it off her chest. Asked me straight out if I'd noticed anything odd about you. Whether you'd said anything to me. Whether I thought you were, in her words, playing something. My stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with performance. What did you tell her? I told her grief does strange things to a man, and that I'd worked in this family long enough to know better than to speculate on what goes on in another person's head. Odessa picked her shears back up, turned one of the dead blooms over in her fingers before snipping it free. It wasn't a lie, Mr. Doyle. I don't know exactly what you're doing. I've made my peace with not knowing. But I want you to understand she's not a fool. She's scared, and scared people get sharp before they get careless. I understand, do you? She looked at me directly then, in a way she rarely allowed herself. Because I've known that girl since she was 23 years old, crying in this garden the week her mother's memory started slipping the first time she noticed it. Whatever she's done, and I have my suspicions, Mr. Doyle, and I expect you know I do, some part of her still loves you enough to lie awake wondering if she's losing her mind for doubting herself. That's not nothing. Be careful what you do with it, I thanked her, and I meant it more than she probably understood, and I walked back to my car with my hands steadier than they had any right to be in my chest carrying a weight I hadn't expected. 2 days later, Desmond called with the kind of urgency that told me before he said a word that we'd reached the part of this where waiting was over. Cross just heard back, he said. Julian wants to do the sale in person. Private, no gallery paperwork, cash adjacent. A wire to an account Cross's people have already flagged as one of the same shells funding the forgery operation. He's not being careful anymore, Everett. He's being fast. When Desmond was quiet for a beat. And in that silence I felt the last loose thread of this whole terrible tapestry finally pull taut. He wants to do it the night of the party, Desmond said. Ash Grove Hall. He told Cross he'll have privacy, a legitimate reason for out-of-town guests to be on the property, and enough noise and movement that nobody will think twice about him stepping away for 20 minutes. He's going to close the sale that funds his silence to Renner in the middle of his own vow renewal. Everett, surrounded by everyone who still believes he's the man he's been pretending to be for 6 years. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling the shape of it settle into place the way a movement settles once every gear finally meshes correctly. "Then that's the night," I said. Ashgrove Hall sat behind a canopy of live oaks dripping with Spanish moss, its wide veranda strung with warm white lights for the occasion, the kind of restored antebellum grace that made for a beautiful backdrop and an uglier irony than any of the assembled guests could have guessed. I arrived a little before 7, dressed in the same charcoal suit I'd worn to Lou's funeral, because it felt right, and because I hadn't thought to buy another one since. Marcus met me near the valet stand, dressed in the black and white uniform of the catering staff Desmond had arranged for him to blend into, a small earpiece tucked discreetly beneath his hair. He didn't say much. He just handed me a folded napkin with a flash drive wrapped inside it, the final restored audio file loaded and ready, and told me where the sound booth was tucked behind the garden's rear pergola. "Odessa's already inside," he murmured. "Says Bree's been watching the door all evening." I found Odessa near the punch table a few minutes later, moving through the crowd with a tray of champagne flutes, playing her part as smoothly as she'd played every other part in this family's life for over a decade. She caught my eye once, just once, and gave the smallest nod, not reassurance exactly, but acknowledgement, the look of a woman who had chosen a side and wasn't going back on it now. The garden filled slowly with familiar faces, Bree's gallery patrons, Julian's old college friends, a scattering of Savannah society who'd known Lou and me for 30 years and had no idea what they were about to witness. A string quartet played something soft and old-fashioned near the fountain. Fairy lights glowed in the branches overhead. It was, I thought, a genuinely beautiful evening, and that beauty was going to make what came next land like a blow to the chest. I saw Julian first, moving through the crowd with a glass of bourbon he wasn't really drinking, shaking hands, laughing at things that weren't especially funny. He looked thinner than he had a month ago. Up close, under the string lights, I could see it in his face, not the polished confidence of the gallery openings I remembered from happier years, but something stretched tight and brittle underneath. At 8:15, I watched him excuse himself from a cluster of guests near the bar and drift toward the side gate, where a man in a well-cut linen jacket stood waiting with the easy patience of someone used to being kept waiting. Nathaniel Cross. I had never met him, would likely never meet him again, and yet I felt a strange gratitude toward this stranger who had agreed to become the final piece of a trap that had taken 4 months to build. I didn't follow them. I didn't need to. Desmond had told me the mechanics would take care of themselves, a folder changing hands near the garden's old carriage house, a wire transfer initiated from a phone screen, federal agents already monitoring the account on the other end. All I had to do was wait, and be present, and let the evening's rhythm carry me toward the one moment that mattered. Bree found me near the fountain a few minutes later, radiant in ivory silk, her hand tucked briefly into mine the way it used to when she was small and wanted to show me something. "Daddy. I'm so glad you came, I wouldn't have missed it," I said, and meant every syllable of it in a way she couldn't possibly understand. She studied my face for a moment. The same careful scrutiny I'd grown used to over these past weeks, and then something in her expression softened, just slightly, into something almost like hope. "You look well tonight," she said quietly. "Really well, I feel like myself," I told her. It was, for the first time in months, entirely true. The toasts began a little after 9. Julian stood at the head of the garden, glass raised, Bree beside him glowing in the string light, and I watched him deliver a speech about second chances and enduring love that would have moved me to tears 4 months ago, before I understood exactly what kind of man was speaking. He thanked the guests. He thanked Bree's late mother for the family she'd raised. My jaw tightened at that, but I kept my face perfectly still, the way I'd practiced in front of my own mirror a dozen times since this began. "And I want to thank my father-in-law," Julian said, raising his glass toward me with a warmth that had once been convincing. "Everett, for trusting us, for trusting me, with everything that matters most." The quartet lifted their bows for the traditional toasting music, a soft waltz meant to carry the moment into applause and champagne. I reached into my jacket pocket and pressed the small transmitter Marcus had given me, the same gesture I imagined I'd rehearsed in some other life, though this was the only life I had. The music didn't finish. It cut, Mid-phrase, the cellist's bow freezing an inch above the strings as every speaker in the garden crackled to life with something that wasn't music at all. It was Lou's voice, not video. Not footage. Just the raw, restored audio. Marcus had spent 4 months coaxing out of a shattered hearing aid. Lou's breathing, ragged and frightened, the particular catch in her throat I would have known anywhere on earth. The crowd's chatter died into confused silence. Somewhere near the punch table, a glass shattered. "Bree, please." "I can't," she said, weak and gasping. "Somebody help me." 2 sets of footsteps entered the recording, unhurried. A voice I recognized instantly, cold and flat in a way it had never sounded in 6 years of family dinners. Bree's voice. "We can't call anyone, Julian. Not yet. If she says the wrong thing to a paramedic about the gallery accounts, I couldn't lose everything over this," another voice answered, Julian's, thinner and more frightened than the confident toast he'd just delivered. "She's not going to make it either way, Bree. Look at her." A long, agonized silence. And then Bree's voice again, quiet and utterly without mercy. "Get her pills. Not the ones by the sink. The empty bottle in the drawer. We put those back after." The garden had gone completely, deathly still. 200 faces turned toward the head table, toward the woman in ivory silk standing frozen beside her husband, her champagne glass slipping from suddenly nerveless fingers to shatter on the flagstone. I did not move from where I stood near the fountain. I did not need to. Every eye in that garden found me anyway, and then found Bree, and the horror on their faces told me everything I needed to know about how completely the last 4 months of careful, patient work had finally paid for themselves. "That's not," Bree's voice cracked, high and disbelieving. "That's edited. That's not what happened. Mama had a heart attack, everyone knows that." Everyone. Nobody answered her. Nobody moved to comfort her. I watched the same wave of recognition ripple through the crowd that had rippled through me 4 months earlier in a repair shop chair, the specific, sickening understanding that what they just heard could not have been faked. Because no one fakes the exact catch of a dying woman's breath, the exact cruelty of a daughter's voice choosing silence over her mother's life. From the direction of the carriage house, I saw movement, men in dark jackets, moving with the quiet economy of people who had done this many times before, converging on Julian and the man I knew as Nathaniel Cross. Julian's face had gone the color of the tablecloth behind him. He turned, saw the agents closing from 2 directions at once, and simply stopped, his hands coming up slowly in front of him, all the fight already gone out of him. Bree hadn't moved. She stood exactly where she'd been standing when the music stopped, staring at me across the ruin of her own garden party. And something in her face broke open that I hadn't seen since she was 11 years old and Lou had caught her in a much smaller lie. "You did this," she said. Not a question. Her voice had gone very small. "You've been, this whole time, you've been." "Yes," I said. She took a step toward me, and one of the agents moving toward Julian shifted his path instinctively, a hand rising, but I gave the smallest shake of my head and he let her come. She stopped an arm's length away, close enough that I could see the particular way grief and fury and something rawer than either were fighting for space on her face all at once. "Did you ever love me?" she asked. Her voice broke completely on the last word. "Any of it? Was any of it real, or was I just a mechanism you were studying, the whole time, waiting to see how I'd fail?" I thought about all the years I'd spent bent over a workbench, learning that a clock doesn't break all at once. It drifts, a fraction of a second at a time, some tiny imbalance compounding quietly until one day the hands simply stop making sense against the truth of the hour. I had loved my daughter for 34 years without ever once checking whether the mechanism underneath was still sound. That failure belonged to me as much as it belonged to her, and I would carry it for the rest of my life alongside everything else. I loved the daughter I thought I raised. I told her, quiet enough that it was only for her. "I'm still learning how to feel about the one standing in front of me." The agents reached her a moment later, and she didn't fight them, didn't scream the way I might have expected. She just kept looking at me as they turned her gently by the shoulder, her mouth working around words that never quite arrived, until the crowd closed in around the space where she'd been standing and I couldn't see her face anymore. The trial, when it came, was mercifully brief. Desmond had warned me it might not be. He'd talked me through worst-case timelines in the weeks after Ashgrove Hall, appeals, delays, a defense attorney working every possible angle to keep the case alive as long as their fading resources allowed. But between the recovered audio, the forged medical directive pulled from Bree's own safe, and Julian's recorded sale to an undercover federal buyer, there was very little left for either of their lawyers to argue with. Julian pleaded to the fraud charges within 6 weeks, hoping for leniency he didn't get. Bree fought longer, but the jury took less than a day once they'd heard Lou's voice asking for help that never came. I didn't attend every session. Desmond understood, and never pushed me to. I went for the parts that mattered, the reading of the charges, the day the jury returned, and let the rest of it happen without me in the room. I had spent months being present for every terrible detail of my wife's death. I didn't feel obligated to be present for every terrible detail of what came after. Bree received 18 years. Julian, with the added weight of the fraud and the forgery ring Desmond's investigator had traced back 3 years, received considerably more. I did not go to the sentencing for either of them. Odessa asked me once, gently, if I regretted that, and I told her the truth, that I had already said everything I had to say to my daughter, in a garden full of string lights, and nothing a judge read into the court record was going to add to it. The estate took longer to settle than the case had. Desmond handled most of it, patient and precise the way he'd always been, and when the final numbers came together, I did the one thing that felt like it actually meant something. I signed the bulk of what remained of Lou's and my life savings into a small non-profit clinic on the edge of the historic district, audiology screenings for the elderly who couldn't afford them, hearing aid fittings for people who'd otherwise go without, a modest wing for early memory care evaluation, the kind of quiet, unglamorous work that might have caught what was happening to Lou months before it became fatal. If anyone had thought to look, we named it the Louisa Doyle Center. Lou would have hated the fuss of a plaque with her name on it. She would have loved everything the building actually did. Marcus took a part-time consulting role there once it opened, helping set up the diagnostic equipment, training the younger staff on the kind of careful listening his own work had taught him. He still runs his little storefront on Broughton Street. He still calls me every few weeks, mostly just to talk, though I think some part of him will always be checking to make sure I'm all right. I let him. It costs me nothing, and it seems to mean something to him. Odessa stayed on at the estate a while longer, and then, when I finally sold the big house and moved into something smaller and easier to manage a few blocks from the shop, she told me plainly that she'd rather keep working for a man who tended his own garden than for an empty house full of memories that weren't hers to carry. She still comes by twice a week. We don't talk about that spring much. We don't need to. I stood at the ribbon cutting on a bright March morning, 6 months almost to the day after Ashgrove Hall, and watched a small crowd of hospital administrators and elder care advocates applaud as the doors opened for the first time. I traced my fingers over the bronze letters of Lou's name on the wall beside the entrance, feeling less like a man delivering a eulogy and more like a man closing a very long repair job, the kind where you sand down every rough edge, reset every misaligned part, and finally, carefully, let the thing run again. I walked home from the clinic that afternoon instead of taking a car. The way I used to walk home from the shop when Lou was still alive and waiting for me with dinner half made and a story about her day. The house was smaller now, quieter, but it was an honest kind of quiet, not the brittle silence I'd learned to perform for 5 months straight. In my workshop out back, on the bench where I'd left it the day everything started, sat the mantel clock Lou had given me for our 30th anniversary, a beautiful, stubborn old piece with a hairline crack in the mainspring that I'd never quite found the heart to fix while she was alive, because fixing it would have meant admitting time was still moving forward without her permission. I sat down at the bench, put on my loop, and got to work. My hands were steady in a way they hadn't been in a long time, not performing steadiness, not concealing a tremor, just genuinely, quietly steady. I replaced the mainspring, set the escapement, adjusted the balance wheel with the same unhurried patience I'd spent my whole life learning. When I finally closed the case and wound it for the first time in years, the room filled with a small, ordinary sound I hadn't let myself hope for in longer than I could say, the clock, ticking, alive, keeping time again.